The story of Wu Zetian begins not in the grandeur of the Forbidden City, but in the shadows of a palace where ambition, cunning, and danger dance together like a deadly waltz. To speak of Wu Zetian is to speak of contradiction itself, a woman of extraordinary intellect, political genius, and unmatched charm, yet also a ruler whose obsessions would twist the lives of countless men and women into instruments of fear. She was born into a world dominated by rigid hierarchy, male authority, and Confucian ideals that deemed women invisible in the corridors of power. Yet from her earliest days, Wu Zetian demonstrated a mind that would not accept the invisible role prescribed to her. She would carve a path through palace intrigue, leaving a trail of awe, terror, and whispered legend. Imagine the sprawling imperial palaces of the Tang dynasty, with golden roofs reflecting the sunlight like molten gold, and corridors echoing with the murmurs of eunuchs and concubines. It was in this world of beauty, wealth, and ceremonial ritual that Wu Zetian first learned the delicate art of observation. Every gesture, every whispered conversation, every smile concealed strategy. To outsiders, she appeared gentle, compliant, even deferential, a seemingly ordinary concubine in a sea of hundreds. Yet behind her eyes was a calculating intelligence, a mind perpetually analyzing the motivations, weaknesses, and desires of those around her. This duality, outward grace masking inward ferocity, would become the hallmark of her reign. From the very beginning, Wu Zetian's obsessions were not mere indulgences but tools of survival and ascension. Her fascination with power, control, and human psychology allowed her to see opportunities where others saw threats. Stories survive of her meticulous attention to palace politics, of how she memorized the loyalties and secret fears of ministers and rivals alike, cataloging each in a mental ledger that would one day decide who lived, who fell, and who would vanish without a trace. It is here, in these early lessons of observation and subtle manipulation, that the seeds of her darker passions, ruthless ambition, obsession with immortality, and the pleasure of dominance, first took root. But her story is not merely one of cunning politics. It is also a story of obsession in its most intimate and terrifying forms. Wu Zetian was enthralled by the human capacity for desire, loyalty, and fear, and she learned to wield each as a weapon. She would come to understand the intoxicating power of psychological dominance, the thrill of bending the wills of others to her own, and the dark satisfaction that could arise from controlling life and death in ways that no ordinary ruler could. Even in her early years as a concubine, she practiced the art of influence with precision, demonstrating a keen understanding that ambition alone was not enough. It had to be paired with perception, manipulation, and the occasional cruelty veiled behind the mask of charm. This section of her life, often shrouded in myth and rumor, also evokes the moral ambiguity that will define her legacy. She was a woman whose brilliance could inspire admiration, yet whose obsessions would ultimately bring terror and suffering. The audience is drawn into the contrast between the beauty of the Tang dynasty's imperial court, the music, the silks, the poetry, and the cruelty that lurked just beneath, orchestrated by a mind that delighted in control and feared nothing but weakness. In this tension, we see the first glimpse of the Shadow Empress, a figure as beguiling as she is horrifying, whose obsessions will ripple outward to rewrite history. By the end of this introduction, the viewer is left on the edge of fascination and dread. Wu Zetian is presented not as a mere historical figure, but as a living, breathing embodiment of obsession, beautiful, terrifying, and unstoppable. Her story promises not just the recounting of historical events, but a psychological journey into the mind of a ruler whose desires were as grand as they were forbidden. The stage is set, the tension palpable, and the audience is compelled to peer into the darkness behind the golden gates, to witness the obsessions that will shape an empire and leave a legacy that continues to haunt the corridors of history. Wu Zetian's rise from an overlooked concubine to the ruler of the most powerful empire in the world is a story of audacity, strategy, and calculated ruthlessness, a climb that would leave a trail of awe and terror in its wake. Born into a world where women were confined to shadows, her ascent defied the rigid hierarchies of Tang China. To understand her obsession with power, we must first step into the corridors of the imperial palace, a labyrinth of opulence and danger, where every gesture, whisper, and glance could mean life or death. She began her journey as a concubine of Emperor Taizong, a position that, while prestigious compared to ordinary women, was perilously low in the social hierarchy of the court. For most, such a position offered comfort but little influence. For Wu Zetian, it was a crucible. Here, she observed the machinations of court life, the alliances, the betrayals, the fragile egos of ministers and princes. She learned quickly that survival depended not merely on charm or beauty, but on understanding the psychology of those around her. Every word spoken by a eunuch, every glance exchanged by a rival concubine, became a piece of intelligence to be carefully catalogued. When Emperor Taizong died, Wu Zetian faced the dangerous liminality of palace life. Widowhood for a concubine was both socially mandated and politically perilous. She could either fade into obscurity or seize the moment to ascend. In her case, her ambitions would not allow obscurity. Placed in a Buddhist convent, ostensibly removed from politics, she did not retreat into despair. Instead, she used her time to hone the very obsessions that would define her reign: the analysis of human weakness, the manipulation of perception, and the cultivation of fear as a tool of influence. Her understanding of power was not abstract. It was intimate, psychological, and often terrifying. Her eventual return to court under Emperor Gaozong marked the beginning of her most audacious moves. Unlike any woman before her, Wu Zetian would not merely serve as a passive partner to power. She would seize it, reshape it, and weaponize it. Historical accounts describe her as employing charm, intellect, and seduction to gain the emperor's trust, positioning herself as indispensable. But beneath the veneer of elegance and devotion, she was already orchestrating the removal of rivals, subtly influencing decisions, and quietly consolidating her influence over ministers, generals, and even the imperial family. Her obsession with control extended to the psychological manipulation of those closest to her. Ministers who once thought themselves untouchable found themselves subject to her scrutiny, with loyalty tested in invisible, cruel ways. Some fell to false accusations, others were humiliated publicly, and still others vanished entirely under mysterious circumstances. Wu Zetian's genius was in making power appear as natural and inevitable, while her enemies often did not realize they were being played until it was too late. She understood that fear could be just as effective as affection, and she wielded both with terrifying precision. The darker aspects of her rise are impossible to ignore. Rumors of murder, forced suicides, and ruthless purges follow her every step. Whether fully factual or amplified by later historians, these stories reveal the psychological truth of her ambition. She was a ruler who would tolerate no obstacle, personal or political. Even family ties were expendable. Princes, cousins, and former allies became pawns in her relentless pursuit of authority. The palace, a place of luxury and ceremony, became a theater of subtle terror under her guidance. It is here that her obsessions, power, dominance, and control first manifest in the extreme ways that would later define her reign. Yet, Wu Zetian's rise was not a simple story of cruelty. It was a demonstration of intellect, strategic foresight, and unrelenting ambition. She understood the symbolic power of perception. An emperor who is respected but feared wields far more influence than one who is merely admired. She cultivated an aura of divine legitimacy, blending Confucian ideals, Buddhist rituals, and political theater to make her ascent appear ordained by heaven itself. Her obsession with perception became as important as her obsession with actual power, a duality that both mesmerized and terrified those around her. By the time she assumed the title of Empress Consort, Wu Zetian had already mastered the delicate art of balance, between charm and intimidation, loyalty and fear, public image and private calculation. Her psychological manipulation extended beyond the emperor. She controlled ministers through flattery, threat, and intrigue. Her enemies rarely realized the trap until it was too late. Even the loyal often lived in constant dread, knowing that favor today could become suspicion tomorrow. The story of Wu Zetian's rise forces us to confront the interplay of intelligence, obsession, and ruthlessness. Unlike rulers who inherited power, she built it from observation, strategy, and the willingness to transgress every societal expectation. Her obsession was not with mere survival, but with absolute dominance, the kind that allows one to shape the course of history itself. By mastering both the mechanics of the court and the psychology of every person in it, she transformed from a concubine hidden in the shadows to the most feared and influential figure in China. In this section of her life, we begin to see the blueprint of her obsessions fully formed: an unrelenting hunger for power, a fascination with control over life and death, and a capacity for manipulation that verged on the supernatural. She became a living embodiment of psychological strategy, where even the smallest gesture could decide someone's fate. The audience begins to sense the magnitude of her ambition, not just the political implications, but the moral and psychological consequences. Her rise was a masterclass in the weaponization of human behavior, a story that is as horrifying as it is mesmerizing. By the end of this section, viewers understand that Wu Zetian's ascent was not accidental. It was deliberate, obsessive, and terrifyingly effective. It sets the stage for the obsessions that would dominate her reign: the pursuit of immortality, the consolidation of absolute power, and the willingness to employ cruelty as an instrument of governance. The audience is drawn further into the paradox of admiration and horror, seeing a ruler who is at once brilliant, ambitious, and terrifyingly ruthless. Wu Zetian's ambition extended far beyond the immediate concerns of politics or courtly intrigue. It reached into the most intimate and terrifying frontier of all, death itself. Unlike most rulers, who feared mortality quietly or left it to divine providence, she became obsessed with the idea of defying it. Immortality was not a metaphor for legacy, it was a tangible, urgent pursuit. Her fascination with elixirs, poisons, and forbidden Taoist practices transformed her obsession into a scientific, mystical, and horrifying enterprise, blending intellect with superstition and beauty with grotesque experimentation. Historical accounts suggest that Wu Zetian experimented with alchemical concoctions in pursuit of eternal youth. These were not casual indulgences, but carefully crafted, secretive rituals performed under the scrutiny of loyal courtiers and Taoist alchemists. Some reports claim she ingested mercury-based potions, whose effects ranged from temporary invigoration to excruciating illness. Others describe herbs and minerals said to prolong life or even grant immortality. In her mind, the boundaries between life and death, science and magic, morality and necessity blurred. She was willing to risk her health, and the health of others, to taste a permanence that no other human could grasp. The obsession was not merely physical. It carried deep psychological undertones. Wu Zetian's preoccupation with immortality reflected a profound fear of irrelevance. To her, death was not just the end of a life. It was the erasure of influence, memory, and power. The idea that her enemies or history might outlive her became intolerable. Every ritual, every potion, every whispered incantation was a means of asserting control over the one certainty that eluded all rulers: mortality itself. In this, her obsession became both terrifying and relatable, a glimpse into the universal human fear of death amplified to extraordinary extremes. Yet, these rituals were more than personal indulgences. They were intertwined with her political strategy. Taoist priests and alchemists were not only guides to immortality, they were instruments of her power. By patronizing them, she commanded religious authority that reinforced her legitimacy, creating a mystique that elevated her above ordinary mortals and rulers alike. Courtiers and ministers were made to believe that Wu Zetian's reign was sanctioned by cosmic forces, that she was touched by the divine. In blending personal obsession with political theater, she transformed mortality itself into a tool of influence, bending superstition and faith to her will. The more we explore this period, the more the contrast between beauty and horror becomes apparent. On one hand, Wu Zetian projected the image of an eternal, flawless empress, radiant skin, graceful presence, and commanding elegance. On the other, the pursuit of that perfection often involved grotesque and dangerous experiments. Courtiers whispered of servants made ill by the alchemical fumes, of secretive laboratories hidden deep within the palace, where exotic herbs, powders, and minerals were combined in the pursuit of life beyond life. There is an eerie tension here. The opulence of her surroundings, the silk robes and jeweled ornaments, juxtaposed against the secret, toxic rituals that promised immortality at a terrible price. Her obsession with eternal life also fueled paranoia. The fear of betrayal and premature death became pervasive, driving her to eliminate anyone she suspected of plotting against her, real or imagined. Every courtier's hesitation, every whispered conversation, could be interpreted as a threat to her survival. The desire to escape death's inevitability magnified her ruthlessness, creating a psychological feedback loop where obsession, fear, and cruelty became inseparable. This relentless pursuit of immortality would haunt her rule, coloring every decision, every act of manipulation, and every execution she ordered. It is impossible to discuss her obsession without acknowledging the moral ambiguity that surrounded it. In the pursuit of life eternal, she may have caused suffering, poisoning allies, and endangering the innocent, yet these acts were justified in her mind as necessary for the survival of her dynasty and her vision. In her perspective, mortality was the ultimate enemy, and any measure taken to overcome it was acceptable. The audience is invited to grapple with this paradox, the human desire for survival versus the ethical cost of pursuing it without restraint. Her obsession also extended into religious ritual. Wu Zetian was known to participate in elaborate ceremonies designed to align her existence with cosmic forces. Buddhist and Taoist practices were manipulated to serve her ends, reinforcing the perception that she was untouchable, divinely favored, and separate from ordinary human limitations. She commissioned prayers, statues, and temples in her name, not merely as symbols of devotion but as instruments of spiritual control. Through these rituals, she sought to bend the metaphysical world to her will, attempting to assert dominion not only over men and governments, but over the natural laws of life and death themselves. The psychological dimension of this obsession is particularly striking. Her quest for immortality was not passive, it was active, consuming, and all-encompassing. It demanded loyalty, secrecy, and sacrifice from everyone around her. Courtiers, alchemists, and servants were drawn into a web of fear and devotion, participating in rituals that often involved extreme danger. Her obsession became contagious, bending the wills of those near her, ensuring that even those who feared her could not escape her influence. In this way, Wu Zetian's personal desire for eternal life reshaped the very culture of her court, creating an atmosphere where obsession, power, and terror intertwined. And yet, amidst the horror, there is undeniable brilliance. Wu Zetian's fascination with immortality demonstrates a mind capable of extraordinary vision. She understood that human existence was fragile and that influence could be fleeting. By attempting to control life and death, she sought to transcend the limitations imposed on every ruler, male or female, before her. In her pursuit, she blurred the lines between genius and madness, courage and cruelty, ambition and obsession. The audience is left to confront the haunting question: how far would one go to escape mortality, and at what cost to others? By the end of this section, Wu Zetian emerges not simply as a ruler obsessed with power, but as a woman consumed by the ultimate human fear. Death was not merely an endpoint for her, it was the ultimate adversary, demanding conquest, manipulation, and obsession. Her experiments, rituals, and manipulations reveal the terrifying extent to which ambition can extend beyond politics into the realm of life, death, and morality. The audience is drawn deeper into the dark labyrinth of her mind, understanding that every act of cruelty or manipulation in the palace may have been motivated not only by control, but by an obsessive desire to outwit the one certainty that haunts all humans: the inevitability of death. Wu Zetian's obsession with power did not remain theoretical, it manifested in blood, fear, and the systematic elimination of anyone who could challenge her. The corridors of the Tang Dynasty palace were gilded and opulent, but beneath the silks, incense, and ceremonial grandeur lurked an atmosphere thick with terror. For Wu Zetian, influence and authority were inseparable from control over life and death. To consolidate her dominion, she orchestrated a series of purges that would leave a permanent stain on history, an unmistakable testament to her ruthlessness and cunning. The purges were not chaotic or indiscriminate. They were meticulously planned, psychologically calculated, and executed with precision. Ministers, royal relatives, concubines, and even eunuchs, all who posed potential threats, were assessed, observed, and categorized according to loyalty, fear, or utility. Those deemed expendable were removed quietly through exile, forced suicide, or mysterious accidents. Others were publicly humiliated, their suffering serving as a warning to all who dared oppose the Empress. In this system, power was both a weapon and a performance, a theater of terror where obedience was enforced as much through anticipation of pain as through the demonstration of it. One of the most infamous aspects of Wu Zetian's purges was her willingness to destroy her own family to secure political dominance. Princes and cousins, men who by birthright might have challenged her authority, were not spared. Historical accounts suggest that her own nephews and sons of the imperial family fell victim to her lethal strategies. These actions were framed not as acts of cruelty, but as necessary measures to preserve the stability of her reign. Yet the psychological impact on the court was immediate. If the Empress could eliminate blood relatives, no one could consider themselves safe. Fear became a tool as powerful as military might or political alliances. Her methods were as diverse as they were terrifying. Some ministers were poisoned, their deaths blamed on natural causes or divine punishment. Others were subjected to public humiliation, ritualized acts designed to strip dignity and enforce obedience. Rumors of secret interrogations, torture chambers, and poison-laced meals circulated among the courtiers, creating a climate of paranoia. Every whisper of discontent, every hesitant gesture, could trigger her scrutiny. The palace itself became a theater of psychological control, where the threat of disappearance was more potent than the promise of reward. Yet, the genius of Wu Zetian's purges was not only in their brutality, but in their subtlety. She understood the psychological power of uncertainty. By selectively targeting individuals and leaving others unharmed, she instilled a sense of perpetual vigilance. Ministers who had once considered themselves untouchable found themselves questioning every word, every glance, every loyalty. The fear of arbitrary punishment ensured obedience more effectively than overt terror alone. In this sense, her obsession with control extended beyond mere physical elimination. It reached deep into the minds of those around her, bending them to her will. These purges also served to elevate her image in the eyes of the court and the empire. By removing rivals, she projected an aura of inevitability and divine sanction. Her actions were framed as protecting the state, maintaining cosmic order, and enforcing justice, even when the underlying motives were deeply personal. The contrast between the outward presentation of a just, powerful ruler and the hidden reality of terror created a moral dissonance that fascinated contemporaries and continues to captivate historians. The audience is left oscillating between admiration for her strategic brilliance and horror at the human cost of her obsessions. Wu Zetian's cruelty was not indiscriminate, it was deeply strategic. She understood the interplay between fear, loyalty, and perception. A minister publicly humiliated or quietly eliminated was also a psychological lesson to the entire court. Disloyalty or weakness would not be tolerated. By orchestrating fear so meticulously, she ensured that her influence extended far beyond the immediate victims. Everyone in her orbit became an instrument in her grand design, a participant in a system where survival depended on constant vigilance, subtle negotiation, and, often, moral compromise. The purges also had profound gendered dimensions. Female rivals, concubines, princesses, and even allies faced unique forms of punishment. Some were exiled to remote monasteries, effectively removing them from political relevance. Others were accused of immorality or conspiracies, charges often fabricated to justify elimination. In every case, the psychological terror was amplified by the stark contrast between the outward beauty and ritualized sophistication of palace life and the hidden cruelty that dictated the fates of these women. Through these acts, Wu Zetian reinforced her control not only as a ruler but as a symbol of lethal feminine intelligence, an embodiment of both allure and danger. Stories from this era are rife with chilling anecdotes. A minister found dead in his chambers with a cryptic note, a princess forced to consume a poisonous elixir, a eunuch disappearing from court without trace. While some accounts may be exaggerated or shaped by later historians, the psychological truth is undeniable. Wu Zetian's reign instilled a pervasive, almost omnipresent sense of vulnerability, ensuring that fear and obedience were inextricably linked. Her obsession with eliminating threats was not merely about survival. It was an expression of her understanding of human nature, of how terror could be wielded as effectively as armies or decrees. The psychological impact of these purges on Wu Zetian herself is equally fascinating. While she emerged as the most powerful ruler of her time, her obsession with control and fear likely intensified her paranoia. Every whisper, every gesture of hesitation, every potential rival became a threat requiring attention or elimination. In this way, her psychological landscape mirrored that of the palace she ruled, beautiful, intricate, but imbued with shadows, traps, and hidden dangers. Her brilliance and her cruelty were inseparable, each feeding the other in a cycle of obsession, strategy, and terror. By the end of this section, the audience sees Wu Zetian not just as a political genius, but as a master of fear and psychological manipulation. Her purges were more than acts of cruelty. They were a systematic re-engineering of the court itself, bending the wills of everyone in her orbit. The gilded palace walls, the silk robes, the lavish ceremonies, all were backdrops to a theater of terror carefully orchestrated by an empress whose obsessions were as dark as they were brilliant. Through fear, control, and the ruthless elimination of rivals, Wu Zetian solidified her power, ensuring that every step she took toward her ultimate ambition, the throne itself, was unstoppable, inevitable, and indelibly marked by blood. Wu Zetian's mastery of power extended beyond strategy and fear. It penetrated the most intimate and taboo aspects of human behavior. Desire, seduction, and sexual manipulation became instruments in her arsenal, tools to bend the wills of men and secure unassailable authority. Unlike many rulers before her, Wu Zetian understood that influence was not only a matter of command or law. It was also a matter of psychology. She used intimacy to entrench loyalty, manipulate rivals, and orchestrate events from the shadows, transforming her sexual relationships into calculated expressions of political control. Her personal relationships were never merely private affairs. They were acts of political theater. Allegedly, she cultivated favor with Emperor Gaozong through a combination of charm, intelligence, and sensuality, presenting herself as both irresistible and indispensable. But what outwardly appeared as affection was a calculated exercise in power. Wu Zetian understood that desire could be weaponized, that a man's infatuation could make him blind to threats, susceptible to suggestion, and willing to bend the mechanisms of government to her will. In this, her obsessions merged intimacy with domination, turning private relationships into instruments of empire. The psychological dimensions of her seduction are particularly fascinating. By controlling desire, Wu Zetian manipulated not only emotions but decisions, creating a court where loyalty was intertwined with fear, pleasure, and obsession. Ministers and officials who once assumed their positions insulated them from danger found themselves caught in webs of intrigue where even compliance could be misinterpreted as defiance. In essence, sexual and emotional manipulation became another method of enforcing obedience, a shadowy extension of the purges and psychological terror she had already perfected. Her sexual strategies were not limited to Emperor Gaozong. Accounts suggest that Wu Zetian cultivated relationships with courtiers, eunuchs, and officials in ways that reinforced her dominance. Alliances forged in intimacy became levers of influence. Rivals were seduced or ensnared, only to be undermined when convenient. Some of these relationships may have been genuine in sentiment, yet in the context of her political objectives, they were inseparable from the machinery of control. The audience sees a ruler who views human desire not as a personal indulgence but as an instrument for shaping reality, a tool as potent as armies, decrees, or fear. Yet, this obsession with sexual and political manipulation had profound moral and psychological consequences. In bending desire to her will, Wu Zetian blurred the lines between love and coercion, pleasure and terror, loyalty and obsession. Her court became a place where intimacy could be deadly, where trust was a liability, and where personal relationships were inseparable from political calculations. Women in the palace, concubines, princesses, and courtiers, faced particularly stark dangers. Allegiances could be coerced, friendships weaponized, and rivalries settled through the most intimate channels. In this way, Wu Zetian's obsessions extended to the very fabric of palace life, making every interaction a potential act of control. The interplay of desire and power also amplified her psychological dominance. By understanding human vulnerabilities, ambition, lust, fear, and vanity, she orchestrated scenarios where her influence was absolute. Ministers made decisions motivated by infatuation or fear of losing favor. Rivals were ensnared through temptation or jealousy. Wu Zetian's obsession with controlling desire created a court in which personal and political survival were inseparable, where even loyalty was measured against the possibility of betrayal, and where the Empress herself remained the invisible hand shaping outcomes. There is a dark elegance in how Wu Zetian combined sexual politics with broader governance. She understood that perception was as powerful as reality. By cultivating rumors, leveraging gossip, and projecting an image of irresistible authority, she ensured that even those who had never directly encountered her were influenced by the aura she carefully constructed. Sexual manipulation was thus not merely private indulgence. It was a performance, a method of reinforcing her supremacy and reshaping the moral and social norms of her court. The consequences of this obsession extended beyond her immediate circle. Wu Zetian's use of intimacy as a political tool set new precedents in imperial governance. Women in her orbit, whether allies or rivals, had to navigate a labyrinth of power in which personal relationships were inseparable from survival. Men in positions of authority were continually reminded that influence could be swayed by charm, temptation, and subtle manipulation. In this way, the Empress's obsessions reshaped the dynamics of power at the highest levels of the Tang dynasty, creating a court where psychology, sexuality, and politics were fused into a single, inescapable system of control. Yet, even as her methods were manipulative and calculated, they also reveal the extraordinary brilliance of Wu Zetian's mind. Few rulers in history have so intimately understood the human psyche, so carefully orchestrating desire, loyalty, and fear to consolidate authority. In her hands, sexuality became not only a personal weapon but a tool of empire, demonstrating a psychological sophistication that was both mesmerizing and terrifying. The audience cannot help but recognize the dark genius at play, a ruler who saw the most private impulses of humanity as threads to be woven into a tapestry of power. The moral tension in this section is undeniable. Wu Zetian's sexual manipulation evokes both fascination and horror, compelling the audience to confront uncomfortable questions about ambition, desire, and control. How far can a ruler go when every relationship, every act of intimacy, is a means to an end? How easily does the line between pleasure and cruelty blur when obsession drives action? Wu Zetian's life demonstrates that mastery of power requires not only intelligence but a willingness to wield the most personal aspects of human nature as instruments of control. By the end of this section, the audience sees Wu Zetian as a ruler whose obsessions were not confined to politics or purges but extended into the very human experiences of love, desire, and trust. Her genius lay in recognizing that influence could be exerted through the mind and the heart as effectively as through force or fear. Sexuality became another battlefield, where victory was absolute and consequences could be fatal. Wu Zetian emerges not merely as a politically formidable figure, but as a psychological strategist of unparalleled skill, whose understanding of desire reshaped the rules of power in ways that continue to captivate and horrify. Wu Zetian's mastery of power was not confined to politics, fear, or intimate manipulation. It extended into the invisible realm of the supernatural. She was deeply fascinated by prophecy, divination, and omens, tools she wielded as effectively as any army or decree. In a court where belief in cosmic order was intertwined with governance, Wu Zetian understood that perception could be molded to suit ambition. Her obsession with prophecy and divination was both personal and political, blurring the lines between superstition and strategy, paranoia and control. From the earliest years of her ascent, she displayed an unusual attentiveness to signs and omens. Astronomical events, eclipses, unusual weather patterns, and even the behavior of animals were meticulously observed and interpreted. In the culture of Tang China, such occurrences were considered messages from heaven, warnings, validations, or judgments. Wu Zetian leveraged these beliefs, interpreting signs in ways that bolstered her authority while sowing doubt and fear among her rivals. She transformed what might have been innocent superstition into an instrument of psychological dominance. Her obsession with divine legitimacy was also deeply personal. Wu Zetian understood that human power was fragile, mortal, and fleeting. In contrast, the authority sanctioned by heaven appeared immutable. By aligning herself with prophecy, she sought not only to justify her rule but also to make her position unassailable. Ministers and generals could question decrees, but the heavens themselves, she implied, had ordained her supremacy. This obsession with cosmic validation reinforced her political decisions and magnified the impact of her psychological strategies, making every courtly action resonate with divine significance. The Empress employed a network of Taoist and Buddhist seers, astrologers, and ritual specialists to interpret signs and provide counsel. Some were genuinely mystical, while others were co-opted into the theater of influence, delivering pronouncements that served Wu Zetian's ends. Reports suggest that she commissioned prophecies predicting her rise to absolute power, transforming fate itself into a tool of political theater. Those who attempted to challenge her were framed as not merely disloyal but as acting against the will of heaven, a transgression that carried profound moral and spiritual weight. Paranoia became a natural extension of her obsession. If the cosmos could favor her rise, it could also warn her of betrayal. Wu Zetian scrutinized every whisper, every hesitation, every subtle sign of disloyalty as potential omens. Ministers who arrived late to court or misread ritual protocol might be interpreted as harboring treachery. Even minor misfortunes were sometimes framed as indications of conspiracy. In this sense, prophecy and paranoia were intertwined. Belief in omens justified her vigilance and her ruthless elimination of threats, while paranoia ensured she never underestimated danger. The psychological effect on her court was profound. Those around her were forced to navigate a labyrinth where natural phenomena, ritual gestures, and the smallest actions could be interpreted as divine messages. Loyalty became inseparable from interpretation, and fear was amplified by the belief that the heavens themselves endorsed the Empress's authority. Every decision, every alignment, every move was made under the weight of cosmic scrutiny, a scrutiny orchestrated by Wu Zetian herself. This created a palace environment where uncertainty, superstition, and terror intertwined, reinforcing her absolute control. Wu Zetian's manipulation of prophecy also served to bolster her public image. Through carefully orchestrated ceremonies, the Empress projected herself as both pious and divinely sanctioned, a ruler whose rise was inevitable and whose authority was unquestionable. Temples were built, statues erected, and prayers commissioned in her name, not simply as acts of devotion but as instruments of perception management. Through these measures, she cultivated an aura of invincibility, making her obsessions visible as both spectacle and psychological strategy. Even those who did not witness her rituals directly could perceive her power indirectly, through rumors, symbolism, and ritual performance. Her fascination with omens and divination also reinforced her obsession with control over life and death. The same mechanisms that allowed her to predict potential threats or opportunities also justified acts of cruelty. A minister accused of conspiracy was not merely eliminated politically, their punishment could be framed as the fulfillment of a cosmic warning. In this way, the Empress fused her obsession with prophecy with her already established strategies of fear, purges, and psychological manipulation. Every act of cruelty was given divine significance, every purge a veneer of cosmic necessity. The interplay between superstition and paranoia reveals a psychological sophistication few rulers have achieved. Wu Zetian understood that human belief could be manipulated as easily as political structures, that fear of divine wrath could be more powerful than fear of the sword. She weaponized perception, ensuring that even the most loyal subjects internalized her authority as both earthly and heavenly. By blending spiritual obsession with political strategy, she created a court in which thought, action, and belief were inseparable, where even minor transgressions became moral, political, and cosmic offenses. Yet, this obsession also carried a personal dimension. Wu Zetian was deeply aware of the fragility of human life and the impermanence of earthly power. Her focus on prophecy and divine favor was an extension of her obsession with survival and immortality. The future was not merely something to be inherited, it was something to be predicted, controlled, and manipulated. By intertwining her fate with the cosmic order, she sought to make herself untouchable, to bend time, belief, and human behavior to her will. Even the most mundane aspects of court life were affected by her obsession. Rituals, ceremonies, and etiquette were scrutinized for signs of loyalty or threat. Every gesture, phrase, or hesitation could be interpreted as aligning with, or defying, the heavenly mandate. Ministers lived in a state of constant vigilance, aware that Wu Zetian's obsession with prophecy might render them guilty of cosmic betrayal without any earthly evidence. Fear became absolute, pervasive, and invisible, extending the reach of the Empress's power into the minds of all who surrounded her. By the end of this section, Wu Zetian emerges as a ruler whose obsessions fused the supernatural with the psychological, creating a palace governed not only by laws and decrees but by belief, fear, and cosmic authority. Her obsession with prophecy, omens, and divination was both a personal compulsion and a strategic instrument, allowing her to manipulate perception, enforce obedience, and justify cruelty. The audience is invited to see the terrifying logic of her mind, that the boundaries between superstition, paranoia, and power could be erased when obsession drives genius. Wu Zetian's use of prophecy and paranoia solidifies her as an empress who understood human psychology in ways that were extraordinary, terrifying, and unprecedented. She weaponized belief, made fear spiritual, and transformed uncertainty into a tool of control. In doing so, she ensured that her reign was not only politically unassailable but psychologically absolute. The audience begins to understand that for Wu Zetian, power was never merely a human concern. It was cosmic, psychological, and total, a domain in which obsession, fear, and strategy merged seamlessly. Wu Zetian's reign was a masterclass in the terrifying fusion of cruelty and authority. She understood that power was not merely about influence or wealth, but about the capacity to define life and death itself. To maintain control, she created a system in which punishment was as carefully calculated as a military campaign, framed not as cruelty but as justice. The line between morality and terror blurred in her court, leaving subjects perpetually uncertain whether the Empress was merciful or merciless, fair or fanatical. In this arena, Wu Zetian's obsessions found their ultimate expression, a ruler whose very sense of justice was inseparable from her desire for control. From the outset, she recognized that the administration of punishment could be a tool of governance as powerful as any edict. Ministers who hesitated, nobles who questioned, and rivals who plotted, even in secret, were swiftly dealt with, often under the guise of law. Some faced exile to remote provinces, a slow and agonizing severance from power and society. Others were coerced into suicide, sometimes through intoxicating poisons, sometimes through psychological torment that rendered life unbearable. Wu Zetian's genius lay not merely in executing punishment but in embedding it with symbolic weight, turning acts of cruelty into lessons for the entire court. The psychological sophistication of her methods was staggering. Public humiliation was often more effective than physical violence. Officials might be paraded through court with insults whispered into their ears, their failures magnified, their dignity stripped away. Such punishments were theatrical, designed to instill fear, shame, and awe simultaneously. They served as a visible reminder that the Empress's power extended not only over life and death but over honor, perception, and the very essence of human dignity. By turning punishment into performance, Wu Zetian ensured that every act reinforced her authority and her obsessions in the minds of all who witnessed or heard of it. Her cruelty was also deeply personal and psychological. Allegedly, she orchestrated scenarios in which rivals were forced to betray friends or family to make impossible moral choices that left them broken. By exploiting the human conscience, she extended her reach far beyond the corporeal. Her punishments became instruments of mental domination, creating a court where fear of both the Empress and one's own moral failings ensured obedience. Wu Zetian understood that the mind could be more pliable and more terrified than the body, and she wielded that knowledge mercilessly. The most notorious acts of punishment were often those cloaked in legality or divine justification. Wu Zetian framed purges, executions, and exiles as acts of moral rectitude, cosmic balance, or protection of the state. Ministers accused of corruption or conspiracy were not merely eliminated, they were labeled as violators of heavenly order, their deaths framed as necessary for justice and the stability of the empire. In doing so, she combined her obsession with control, her fascination with divine legitimacy, and her penchant for cruelty into a single, inescapable mechanism of governance. The psychological impact on the court was profound. Resistance or dissent could be construed as both political treason and moral failing, leaving no room for challenge. Women in Wu Zetian's court faced unique dimensions of punishment, often tied to societal expectations of loyalty, obedience, and virtue. Concubines, princesses, and female officials could be accused of immorality, witchcraft, or conspiracy, charges sometimes fabricated for political expediency. Punishments ranged from exile to forced monastic life, often accompanied by public shaming rituals that magnified humiliation and reinforced her dominance. By controlling the fates of women, Wu Zetian not only neutralized threats but also projected her authority as a female ruler in a male-dominated hierarchy. Her obsession with control and dominance extended beyond gendered politics, encompassing the moral, spiritual, and social dimensions of courtly life. Even the most subtle infractions could trigger severe consequences. A hesitant gesture, a misinterpreted word, or a perceived slight could be treated as evidence of treason or moral corruption. In this sense, Wu Zetian's obsession with control created a system in which fear became a constant, invisible force. Ministers and courtiers internalized the threat of punishment, self-regulating their behavior to avoid disfavor. Her genius was in making the absence of action, or the wrong kind of thought, just as dangerous as overt disloyalty, extending her influence into the private psychological realm of every courtier. Wu Zetian's use of punishment also reinforced her personal mythology. By controlling the narrative surrounding acts of cruelty, she presented herself as both a just ruler and a divinely sanctioned arbiter. Every execution, exile, or humiliation was framed as part of the cosmic balance, the moral correction necessary to maintain order. Her obsession with perception ensured that even acts of extreme cruelty could be interpreted as righteousness, leaving observers captivated, fearful, and often complicit in their own subjugation. The audience begins to see the terrifying logic of her reign. Cruelty was not an aberration but a calculated instrument of power, legitimized by obsession and strategy. The psychological reach of her punishments extended to those who observed rather than participated. Stories of her methods circulated widely, creating a culture in which rumor, fear, and awe reinforced obedience. Even distant officials or provinces understood that rebellion or disloyalty could invite consequences of unimaginable severity. Wu Zetian's obsession with control transformed punishment into a communication system, a silent language of terror and authority that transmitted power across space, status, and social hierarchy. Her cruelty also had a recursive effect on her own psyche. Each act of punishment reinforced her belief in the necessity of control, in the vulnerability of human loyalty, and in the effectiveness of fear as a governance tool. Wu Zetian's obsessions, immortality, power, perception, and divine legitimacy, intertwined seamlessly with her administration of justice, creating a feedback loop in which cruelty was both an instrument and an affirmation of her supremacy. In this way, punishment became a mirror reflecting her obsessions back upon herself, shaping both her mind and her empire. By the end of this section, the audience understands that Wu Zetian's use of punishment was more than political expedience. It was an expression of her deepest obsessions. Her reign demonstrates the terrifying potential of cruelty when combined with psychological insight, strategic genius, and obsessive control. The Empress emerges as a figure who not only defined the law but redefined morality itself, bending justice to her will and making fear an integral component of governance. In her hands, punishment was transformed into a theater of power, where every act was meticulously calculated, psychologically profound, and morally ambiguous. Wu Zetian's legacy in this arena leaves the audience both fascinated and unsettled. Her obsessions, manifested in cruelty disguised as justice, highlight the paradox of human ambition. The same intelligence and psychological insight that enables greatness can also orchestrate terror. Through her mastery of punishment, she created a court in which obedience, fear, morality, and survival were inseparable, demonstrating that power, when wielded through obsession and strategic cruelty, can become absolute. Wu Zetian's reign left a legacy as complex, extraordinary, and terrifying as the Empress herself. By the time of her death, she had transformed not only the court but the entire structure of Chinese governance, leaving indelible marks on history that persisted long after her passing. Her obsessions, with power, control, immortality, and the manipulation of human behavior, had reshaped the moral, social, and political landscape of the empire. In examining her legacy, one confronts the paradox of brilliance and terror, innovation and cruelty, authority and obsession. Her administrative reforms were among the most enduring aspects of her legacy. Wu Zetian reorganized the bureaucracy, promoting merit-based appointments and establishing systems to monitor officials' performance. In a society dominated by aristocratic privilege, these changes both expanded opportunities and reinforced her control. Her obsession with power translated into a governance system where loyalty was constantly tested, and efficiency became a tool for consolidating influence. Yet even these seemingly progressive reforms were inseparable from her darker strategies. Ministers were monitored, loyalty scrutinized, and failure could still result in exile or death. The brilliance of her reforms lay in their dual nature. They advanced the state while deepening her psychological dominance over it. Beyond administrative innovation, Wu Zetian left a profound mark on religion and ideology. She skillfully manipulated Buddhist and Taoist institutions to legitimize her authority, presenting herself as the divinely favored ruler of heaven and earth. Temples were built in her honor, statues commissioned, and rituals staged to reinforce her image as a figure ordained by cosmic forces. Her obsession with divine sanction allowed her to transcend conventional gender roles, making her not merely a female ruler but a quasi-divine presence in the eyes of her subjects. The fusion of religious symbolism, political power, and personal obsession created a unique form of authority, one that blurred the boundaries between the spiritual and the temporal, the ethical and the manipulative. Wu Zetian's reign also fundamentally altered the perception of women in Chinese political life. As the only female emperor in Chinese history, she shattered preconceived notions about female capability, ambition, and intelligence. Her obsessions with control, manipulation, and dominance demonstrated that women could wield power with the same ruthlessness, strategic vision, and psychological acuity as men. Yet this empowerment came at a moral cost. Her methods, purges, manipulation, and the orchestration of fear ensured that her legacy would always be viewed through a lens of both admiration and horror. The paradox of her rule challenges the audience to confront uncomfortable questions. Can brilliance exist without cruelty? Can ambition be separated from obsession? Wu Zetian's life offers no easy answers. The cultural and psychological ramifications of her obsessions also echo across generations. The palace, once a site of ceremony and opulence, became a stage for fear, manipulation, and surveillance under her rule. Ministers, courtiers, and allies internalized her strategies, learning that survival depended on constant vigilance, adaptability, and obedience. This psychological legacy, of fear as a governing principle, of obsession as a tool of control, extended far beyond her lifetime. It shaped subsequent perceptions of imperial authority, influencing how rulers and subjects alike approached power, loyalty, and ambition. Wu Zetian's obsessions had created not only immediate effects in her court but also long-term psychological and cultural paradigms for Chinese governance. Her obsession with immortality and divine legitimacy also left a symbolic mark on history. Though she did not achieve eternal life in the literal sense, she ensured a form of immortality through historical record, legend, and memory. The same cunning, ruthlessness, and strategic genius that made her feared also cemented her place in history. Her name, her actions, and her obsessions continue to captivate scholars, writers, and audiences today, inspiring fascination, horror, and awe. In this sense, her obsession with outliving mortality was realized through narrative, influence, and cultural memory. Wu Zetian's life became a living myth, a dark exemplar of ambition and the human capacity for both brilliance and cruelty. Yet her legacy is also a cautionary tale about the dangers of obsession. The same qualities that enabled her to rise to unprecedented power, strategic brilliance, psychological insight, and fearless ambition, also fueled extreme cruelty, paranoia, and manipulation. She demonstrated how obsessions, when intertwined with power, could reshape an empire while leaving a trail of suffering and fear. Her life challenges the audience to reflect on the moral and psychological costs of ambition unchecked, raising questions that resonate far beyond the historical context of Tang China. How far can one push the boundaries of desire, control, and influence before morality is compromised? How does obsession redefine leadership, loyalty, and human relationships? The emotional impact of her reign is also undeniable. Wu Zetian's story evokes a mixture of admiration and dread, wonder and horror. Audiences are compelled to witness the breadth of her genius while confronting the moral darkness that accompanied it. This duality, the tension between brilliance and cruelty, power and obsession, is central to understanding her enduring significance. She was a ruler who could inspire innovation, enforce order, and achieve greatness, yet also manipulate, terrify, and destroy with a precision that few could match. Her legacy is a mirror, reflecting the complex, sometimes contradictory nature of human ambition. Finally, Wu Zetian's influence on history extends to the very notion of human nature itself. She demonstrated that intelligence, ambition, and psychological insight are not inherently virtuous or benevolent. They can be harnessed as tools of terror as readily as tools of progress. Her obsessions, control, immortality, fear, and manipulation, serve as a lens through which to examine the interplay of power and psychology, the costs of ambition, and the moral compromises often hidden behind historical greatness. In shaping China's political, cultural, and psychological landscape, Wu Zetian became more than a ruler. She became a symbol of the potential and peril inherent in human desire and obsession. By the end of this section, the audience is left to grapple with the full magnitude of her legacy. Wu Zetian emerges as a ruler whose obsessions reshaped an empire, challenged societal norms, and left a cultural imprint that endures to this day. She was a figure of genius and terror, ambition and obsession, brilliance and cruelty, a paradox that continues to haunt history. Her life reminds us that obsession, when fused with power, can achieve greatness while leaving behind shadows that endure far beyond a single lifetime. The Empress who once walked the gilded halls of the Tang dynasty remains immortal not through the body, but through the enduring influence of her obsessions, the transformation of history, and the haunting fascination she inspires. Wu Zetian's life and reign close as a study in contrasts, brilliance and terror, ambition and obsession, human ingenuity and moral ambiguity. She remains the only female emperor in the history of China, yet her story is far more than a tale of gendered exceptionalism. It is a chronicle of a mind that weaponized obsession, a ruler who understood that power is never just political, it is psychological, spiritual, and deeply human. As we reflect on her legacy, it becomes clear that her obsessions were not mere quirks of character but defining forces that reshaped the Tang dynasty and left an indelible imprint on history. Even after her death, the shadow of her obsessions lingered. The empire she ruled had been transformed, not only administratively and politically, but psychologically and culturally. Ministers and courtiers internalized the lessons of fear, loyalty, and manipulation she had imparted through decades of calculated cruelty and observation. Her use of purges, sexual manipulation, superstition, and ritualized justice created a template for power that extended beyond her lifetime. Wu Zetian had demonstrated that the exercise of authority was inseparable from the ability to shape belief, control perception, and wield obsession as a tool as potent as any army. Her obsessions also provoke moral reflection. History remembers her both as a pioneering ruler and as a figure of terrifying ruthlessness. For some, she is admired for her intelligence, strategic genius, and administrative reforms. For others, she embodies the dangers of ambition unfettered by ethical constraints. The tension between these perspectives mirrors the larger human struggle, the capacity for extraordinary achievement coexisting with the potential for cruelty, manipulation, and obsession. Wu Zetian's life forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the price of power and the human capacity for moral compromise. Perhaps her most enduring obsession, control, offers the deepest insight into her mind. Wu Zetian understood that true power extends beyond force or law. It encompasses influence over thought, perception, and belief. Through careful orchestration of fear, desire, superstition, and ritual, she bent the psychological landscape of her court to her will. This mastery of human behavior, combined with her political and administrative acumen, elevated her from a singularly ambitious concubine to an empress whose authority was felt as much in the minds of her subjects as in the decrees she issued. In this, Wu Zetian's obsessions were inseparable from her genius, revealing the intricate interplay between psychological insight and political mastery. Her obsession with immortality, though unfulfilled in the literal sense, achieved a form of eternal resonance through historical memory. Wu Zetian's story is retold centuries later with fascination, horror, and awe. She continues to inspire scholarship, literature, and media precisely because her obsessions illuminate the extremes of human ambition. By seeking to outwit death, manipulate perception, and dominate the human psyche, she became immortal not in flesh but in narrative, demonstrating that obsession, when fused with intellect and power, can transcend mortality. The paradox of her legacy is central to her enduring fascination. Wu Zetian was a ruler who could inspire reform, advance governance, and wield influence with unparalleled skill. Yet the same intelligence and obsession also fueled paranoia, cruelty, and terror. She was capable of remarkable vision, yet ruthless in execution, brilliant in strategy, yet morally ambiguous in practice. Her life presents a moral mirror, reflecting both the potential and the peril inherent in human ambition. The audience is left grappling with the uneasy truth that brilliance and horror can coexist, that achievement and obsession are often inseparable, and that history remembers both with equal intensity. In the end, Wu Zetian's obsessions shaped not only the Tang dynasty but the broader narrative of human nature. She demonstrates that ambition, intelligence, and psychological acuity are neither inherently virtuous nor inherently destructive. They are amplified by the obsessions and intentions of the individual. Her life offers a lens through which to examine the interplay of power, morality, and human desire, revealing the depths to which obsession can shape history. The Empress becomes a cautionary figure, a reminder that the pursuit of greatness carries profound moral and psychological consequences. Her story also illuminates the ways in which fear, fascination, and awe can intertwine in human perception. The very qualities that made her terrifying, ruthlessness, manipulation, obsession, also inspire fascination and admiration. This duality is at the heart of her legacy, a ruler whose genius is inseparable from her cruelty, whose obsessions are inseparable from her power. She compels us to consider not only the historical impact of her reign but also the enduring human questions she embodies. What is the cost of ambition? How far can obsession take us before it consumes the very world we seek to control? By the conclusion of her story, Wu Zetian emerges as a figure both monumental and morally complex. She is not merely a historical ruler, but a psychological case study, a symbol of the extremes of human ambition and obsession. Her life challenges the audience to hold two truths simultaneously, that genius can coexist with terror, that ambition can achieve greatness and inflict suffering, and that history can be shaped as much by obsession as by law, strategy, or intellect. The shadows she cast, over the Tang dynasty, over human nature, and over history itself, remain vivid, reminding us that obsession, in the hands of extraordinary minds, can reshape the world. In the silent reflection of history, Wu Zetian's obsessions endure. They linger in the psychological patterns of governance, in the myths and stories that continue to captivate us, and in the moral questions her life poses to every generation. Her reign demonstrates the terrifying power of human obsession, its capacity to create and destroy, to inspire and horrify. As the Empress who defied mortality, manipulated desire, weaponized fear, and commanded awe, Wu Zetian stands immortal not merely through achievement, but through the haunting resonance of her obsessions, the eternal shadows of a ruler who rewrote history through the relentless pursuit of power.